Magda the Mammoth Hunter. Text by Tony Williams. Illustrations by Toni Morris. Lucy is amazed when her father takes her to see ancient cave paintings. Who was the girl in the picture, and why was she being chased? The story takes us back to the time when giant mammoths roamed the earth. Magda the Mammoth Hunter. Text by Tony Williams. Illustrations by Toni Morris. Chapter 1. The Painting. Lucy stopped at the entrance to the cave. A strange feeling came over her. Her father turned and looked at her. "What's the matter?" he asked. "I don't know," Lucy said. "I just feel weird. Almost like I've been here before." Her father laughed. "I don't see how you could have been. We've never even been in this country before." It was true. Lucy was from Melbourne. Her father was a professor of art. He was taking her on a tour of Europe. They had been to London and Paris. Now they were in the Czech Republic. Lucy's father had told her that today he was taking her somewhere really special. Lucy had asked him where. He had already taken her to a lot of famous art galleries, like the Louvre in Paris. "A cave," he had told her. "In that case, I'm bringing a torch," Lucy had replied. Lucy had thought her father was joking. She was surprised to be standing outside a cave. She kept her torch in her pocket. It wasn't dark in the cave because there were lights shining inside it. "Come on," said her father, and Lucy followed him in. Though it was light inside the cave, it was cold. Their footsteps echoed against the stone walls. They walked down some steep steps. Some people were standing at the bottom looking at something. Lucy could see them, but she could not see what they were looking at. The cave wall jutted out at that point and blocked her view. Lucy's father got there first. He was really excited by what he saw. He took his glasses off and peered closely at it. Because he was so impressed, Lucy decided she would not be. She always did that with her father. It was a game they played. When she got to the bottom of the steps, she did not look. She walked up to her father, and then she turned on her heel and looked. Her mouth dropped open. There on the rock wall was a huge painting. In the middle of it were some big animals that looked like elephants with long woolly coats. Even though she was impressed, Lucy still tried to act cool. "Why is that elephant wearing a jacket?" she asked. "It's not an elephant," her father said. "It's a mammoth." There was a herd of mammoths. Next to them were what Lucy thought at first were reindeer. They had big antlers, but these reindeer only had 2 legs. They were men wearing deerskins. They were pretending to be deer to hunt the mammoths. However, they were not chasing the mammoths. They were chasing a smaller figure, a girl. She had brown hair, the same colour as Lucy's, and would have been about the same age, 10 years old. She was running away, but there was something in front of her. At first, Lucy could not make out what it was. Then she realised it was a pit. The little mammoth girl was running straight towards the pit. "It's a wonderful painting, isn't it?" said her father. "It must have been painted during the Ice Age, when herds of mammoths roamed around here. Just think, this painting is about 15,000 years old." "I wonder who painted it," Lucy said. Her father did not hear her. He was too busy looking at the painting. Lucy wondered if the girl had escaped. She wondered if the girl was the one who had done the painting. "I hope you painted it," Lucy said under her breath. "I hope you escaped. little Mammoth girl. Chapter 2. The Coming Storm. Magda stopped at the entrance to the hut. A strange feeling came over her. Her father turned and looked at her. "What's the matter?" he asked. "I don't know," Magda said. She looked up at the dark clouds in the sky. "I think the weather is changing." Her father nodded. In the tribe they called Magda the lucky one. They said that sometimes she knew things that were going to happen before they happened. Magda went into the hut. It was round with a curved roof and was built out of mammoth bones with turf pushed into the gaps. Her father followed her in, pulling the leather flap over the entrance to keep the wind out. On the floor was a mat made of long mammoth hairs that had been twisted together. Inside, Magda's mother was combing Magda's little sister's hair with a comb made from antlers. The little girl, Henka, was wearing a necklace made of shells. When she had finished combing Henka's hair, her mother put a hair clip in it that was made out of mammoth bone. Birds and flowers had been carved on it. "How was the hunt?" asked Magda's mother. "The reindeer have gone," said Magda's father. "But the mammoths are still here." "They will be moving south soon," Magda said. "Winter is coming." "Then we must hunt before we lose the herd," said her father. Magda looked at her father. She was about to ask something she had often asked before. But when she did, the answer was always the same. "Father," she said, "can I come with you to hunt mammoths tomorrow?" Her father shook his head. "Only the men can hunt." "But boys go too," Magda said. "Yes, but those are boys who are nearly men. They go to learn and they stay on the edges of the hunt. And they are boys. You are a girl." "What difference does that make?" Magda said. She was really getting angry now. Her jaw was jutting out as she spoke. "Girls are supposed to learn to cook, sew, and to pick berries," her father replied. "Pick berries?" Magda interrupted with a laugh. "What's the fun in that? Do I need a spear to pick berries? Do they fight back? No. I want to go on the mammoth hunt." "You can't. You are a girl," her father repeated. "I am as tall as a boy, and I am as strong as a boy," Magda said. It was true. Magda was very strong. When the tribe had to move the village to follow the mammoth herds, Magda was one of the quickest at taking down the huts. Then the tribe rolled the mammoth bones from each hut into a mammoth hide and dragged them along. Many people had said how strong Magda was at this work. Her father stared at her. If ever a woman was to take part in the hunt, it would be Magda. But no woman had ever taken part in the hunt. It was too dangerous. "No," he said. Magda was so angry that she pushed the leather flap aside and stormed out of the hut. "Parents," she muttered. When would they stop telling their children what to do? Would there ever be a time when women were allowed to do what men did? She looked up at all the stars in the night sky. A chill wind blew through the pine trees nearby. Magda shivered and the hair stood up on the back of her neck. But it wasn't the cold that made that happen. It was what the others called Magda's luck. She seemed to have a way of knowing when something was going to happen. She knew now without any doubt that a storm was coming. That meant tomorrow would be a different day. Magda turned and went back in the hut. Tonight she would need a good sleep. She sensed that tomorrow would be a different day for her too. Chapter 3. In the Pit. Magda's father started early. The hunt might have to look for the mammoth herd if it had moved in the night. Magda, her mother and her sister got up at the same time and started work. They took the clay pots from last night's meal down to the waterhole to wash them. Then they went gathering food with the other women. It was too late in the season for berries, so they walked among the oak trees picking up acorns. Magda ran ahead, scooping the acorns off the ground and putting them into a leather pouch that she wore around her waist. The weather was cold and she was dressed in furs from head to toe. The sky was black now and there was a heavy feeling in the air. The storm wouldn't be long coming. She was so busy that she did not realise she was getting away from the group. She was on the side of a hill. She looked down to see everyone below her. The small children were in a group in the middle of the women. Some of them were throwing acorns at each other. The women were talking as they worked. Nobody took any notice of Magda up on the hillside. Suddenly, she heard a sound. It was a horn blowing. She knew what it meant. It was the sound to signal to the other men in the tribe that they had found the mammoth herd. The hunters must be close by. Magda looked down at the women. They were still talking. No one was looking at her. Quickly, she hid behind an oak tree. She waited until the laughter of the women and children grew quieter. Then she hurried towards the sound of the horn. She had to climb further up the hill. When she reached the top, the wind blew cold through her long brown hair. Before her was a grassy plain. Over to her right, in a patch of trees, she could see a herd of mammoths. Some of the mammoths were using their long woolly trunks to twist around the tree branches to pull the leaves into their mouths. Others were tugging at plants on the ground. Magda could not see any hunters. They must be hiding in the grass or in the bushes. She made her way down the hill. Soon she was on the edge of the grass. The mammoths were not far away. She had never been this close to live mammoths before. She was amazed at how big they were. Some of them were as tall as the trees. And they had fierce long tusks. She had seen such tusks after a hunt. The tusks looked even bigger on the head of a real mammoth. She wouldn't like a jab from one of those tusks. Magda moved closer. She wasn't scared of the mammoths. She was more frightened of getting caught by her father. But where were the hunters? Then she heard something. It was a different sound. It was coming from the trees. Magda was very quiet now. She got down on her hands and knees and crept forward until she could see what was happening. There were some trees right next to the grass. Behind them was another clearing. In the middle was the strangest creature Magda had ever seen. It looked like a giant spider with many arms and legs. Then she realised it was men digging. They were up to their waists in a pit. Some men were making it deeper by breaking up the ground with antler horns. Others were shoveling out the loose earth with mammoth rib bones. "That's enough!" someone shouted, and all the men jumped out of the pit. They covered it with loose branches. They only had to dig it deep enough to trap a mammoth. Then they would kill the mammoth with their spears. The men slowly made their way through the long grass behind the herd of mammoths. They were very careful, and so it took them a long time. Meanwhile, the weather was getting even colder. Magda looked up at the sky, which was full of black clouds. Snow was starting to fall. The hunters would have to hurry before the storm came. Magda did not move. She watched and waited. Then across to her left, she saw a deer. She thought that was strange, as her father had told her all the deer had gone. But then she saw that it was not a real deer. It was a man. He had a deer's hide across his back and he wore antlers on his head. One of the mammoths stopped eating and turned to look at him. The mammoth must have thought it was a real deer because it went back to tugging at the leaves of a tree. The snow was falling more heavily. The wind picked up and began to howl. Magda shivered where she lay. She watched as more men dressed as reindeer appeared. They began to move towards the mammoths. Then other men, who were not covered in deerskins, stood up from the long grass. They were showing themselves now to try and scare the mammoths towards the pit. Some of the men were quite close to Magda. She looked at their faces in case one was her father. Snowflakes hit Magda on her bare hands and on her hair, but she ignored them. She was looking at the men's faces. She thought she knew all the men in her tribe, but she didn't recognize any of these men. Then she knew why. These men weren't in her tribe. Suddenly, a foot struck Magda's leg. One of the hunters fell to the ground. He looked at Magda in surprise. He had not seen her there. Then he reached out a hand to try and grab her. Magda jumped to her feet and began to run. She was inside the circle of hunters. There was only one way to go, straight towards the mammoths. The storm was gusting now, and a blizzard of snow was driving in her face. She could hardly see. She could just make out the shapes of the mammoths. They were lumbering towards her. She turned away from them. She turned away from the hunters. There was only one way to go, straight to the pit. She kept running, hoping she would miss it. But the snow was on the ground and in her eyes. Suddenly she felt the ground give way beneath her. She hit the bottom of the pit, rolled once and stopped. Luckily, the hunters had not dug too deep. The top of the pit was just above her waist. She had fallen through some leaves. The branches were still above her. She hoped they would hide her. She heard the storm get worse. There was a rumble of thunder. But it didn't clap once and stop, like thunder normally did. This went on and on without stopping. It wasn't thunder. It was the sound of a herd of giant mammoths stampeding towards her. The ground around Magda began to shake. The noise became deafening. Magda heard the mammoths trumpeting all around her. She huddled in the pit and waited for one of them to come crashing in on top of her. But they all missed it. Blinded by the blizzard, the hunters had not been able to drive them to the pit. Magda heard the hunters running and shouting to each other. Then it all went quiet. Magda waited a bit. Then she poked her head up through the branches covering the pit. It was still snowing heavily. She bent down into the pit again and waited for the snow to stop. Chapter 4. The Saber-toothed Tiger. When the snow finally stopped, Magda pushed the branches aside and climbed out of the pit. There were no mammoths and no hunters. Everything she could see was covered in crisp white snow. She began to walk in the direction of her village. There was a rocky hillside in the way. As she climbed it, the snow began to fall again. She could hardly see through it. Then Magda stopped. Her hair was rising on the back of her neck again. There was danger nearby. What was it? Frantically, she looked around her. At first, she couldn't see anything. Then she saw a movement. It was hard to make out. It was as if something white was moving through the snow. Then she made out the shape of a head. She could see the hungry eyes and the two long curved teeth. She still could not make out the shape of the body, but when she saw those curved teeth, she knew exactly what she was looking at. It was a saber-toothed tiger. It had not seen her yet. Quickly, Magda scrambled around the side of the hill, out of sight of the beast. She hoped the falling snow would cover the sounds of her movement. She hoped it would fill her footprints. She hoped the snow and the wind would wipe out her scent. She scrambled along until she saw a gaping hole in the hillside. It was a cave. She ran into it. It was dark inside. She could hardly see. Her hand touched against the wall. She felt her way along it, scared of what creatures might be inside the cave. All at once the floor seemed to disappear. She fell, scraping down a rocky slope, until, with a thud, she hit the bottom. She lay there, hardly able to move. Slowly, the dangers of the day caught up with her. Exhausted, she fell asleep. At first, when she woke in the darkness of the cave, Magda did not know where she was. Then she remembered. She stood up. The hair rose on the back of her neck again. Suddenly she realised she was not alone in the cave. From above, she heard a low growl. The saber-toothed tiger was also in the cave. This was its lair. She heard it scrape its paw on the ground. It sounded high above her head, and she realised it could not get down to her. Her life had been saved by the slope she had fallen down. But what was she to do? The saber-toothed tiger would just wait there for her until she tried to get out. Was there another way out of the cave? Magda felt her way along the wall in the darkness. It seemed as if she was in a big cavern. After a while, she thought she must have gone in a circle. Magda took off the pouch of acorns and laid it on the ground. She went around again until her foot stumbled on something. It was the pouch of acorns. Yes, she had gone in a circle. That meant there was no other way out of the cave. She bent down to pick up the acorns. She would have to keep eating them and hope the tiger went away to feed. Magda sat down and leaned against the wall. But she fell backwards. The wall wasn't there. There was a hole. She tied the pouch around herself again. Then she pushed both hands into the hole. It seemed wide enough for her to get through. She wondered if the hole would lead out of the cave. She began to crawl through the hole and along a tunnel. It was so dark. She could not see anything. The tunnel got narrower. Magda thought it was coming to an end. Then it got wider again. Soon she could not feel the walls on either side. She reached up above her head. There was nothing. Slowly she got up. She was able to stand. Her echoing footsteps told her she was in another big cavern. She walked forwards with her hand stretched out in front of her until she came to a wall. She used the wall as a guide and walked along it. Then she stopped. She could hear something. The sound of water running over rocks. It must be an underground river. She wondered if it flowed out of the hillside. Magda walked towards the sound until she heard water splashing under her feet. She reached down to touch it. She could feel which way the current was flowing by the way the water ran through her fingers. She walked in that direction. The water was getting deeper. Then she saw light. Magda walked faster until light filled the tunnel. The waters of the river bubbled out onto the hillside. The opening was small, but she managed to squeeze through it. The cold wind hit her face at once, but it was good to breathe in fresh air again. Magda made her way back to her village through the snow. She began to run. It would be good to see her family again. She came out of the trees. She stopped. The village wasn't there. Only one hut remained. It was the one that belonged to the old woman who had died soon after they arrived. Magda's tribe had moved on. They had left her behind. Magda went into the old woman's hut. She found some dry moss on the floor and some flintstones. She went outside and collected some firewood from the trees. She could just make out sticks jutting through the snow. When she had collected an armful, she carried them back to the hut. Inside, she put the dried moss in the fireplace. She knelt close to it, rubbing the flintstones until sparks jumped off them. They landed in the moss and it began to smoke. Carefully, she added more moss and then the thinner sticks. They were still wet from the snow and gave off a lot of smoke. But they burned and the flames grew higher. She added more sticks and soon the fire warmed her. Then she took some acorns out of her pouch. She took out a knife made from a row of sharp flintstones stuck into a bone handle. After she had used the knife to peel the skins off the acorns, she roasted them over the fire. They tasted good. Magda was on her own now. She knew she needed a weapon to defend herself. She put some more wood on the fire, and then she went back out to the trees. A sapling yew tree was growing in the clearing. She put her hand around it. It was just the right size. She cut down the yew tree and took it back to the hut. First she trimmed off the branches. Then she cut one end to a point with her knife. She held the slender trunk over the fire one part at a time. She did not hold it there long enough for the wood to burn, but long enough to dry out some of the resins inside. Magda started from the middle and worked out to the edges. When she got to the sharp end, she dipped it into the flames and pulled it out again. She did this many times. The end became very hard and very sharp. Now she had a spear. Night was falling. Magda put the rest of the wood on the fire, curled up close to it, and fell asleep. Chapter 5. The Mammoth. When Magda woke, the fire had gone out. There was no more dry moss inside the hut. There would be none outside. It would all be wet from the snow. It was time to leave the hut and search for her parents. She headed south, back through the valley where the other tribe had been hunting the mammoths. Then she heard a noise in the trees. She went closer to see what it was. Suddenly the snow moved. Magda stepped back in fright. It was a mammoth. But it was the same height as her. At first, Magda could not understand why. Then she saw that it was in the pit. It was only young, about half as big as a full-grown mammoth. The mammoth raised its trunk and trumpeted at her. Then it charged at her. Magda stepped back. But the mammoth could not reach her because it was still in the pit. Then she realized it had not charged her at all. The young mammoth was trying to get out of the pit. She decided to help it. Nearby was an old tree that had come down in the wind. It had been eaten away by insects, so it wasn't very heavy. But it might be strong enough for the young mammoth to stand on. Magda went over to it and tried to roll it, but it wouldn't move. She tried harder, but it was too heavy. Then she took the end of her spear and wedged it under one end of the tree. She pushed the other end of her spear. The tree moved. Hardly at all, but it did move. For a long time Magda kept doing this, until finally the tree was on the edge of the pit. Then it toppled over. The young mammoth backed away. "Go on," said Magda, trying to get her breath back. "Go up the tree." The mammoth stayed still. "Step on it," said Magda, pointing at the tree trunk. Suddenly the mammoth seemed to understand. It charged forward and put its front legs on the tree trunk. There was a loud crack. The weight of the mammoth had broken the tree, but not before, with one push and a scramble, it had climbed out of the pit. Even for a small one, the mammoth was huge. It towered over Magda. For a moment she was frightened. She thought the mammoth was going to charge. It lifted its woolly trunk and let out a sound that was between a grunt and a roar. Then it turned and walked away. It must have been saying thank you. When Magda had got her breath back, she started to walk south again. She knew where her family might be. The mammoths always followed the same trails, and her tribe always followed the mammoths. Soon it started to snow again. There was no cover, so Magda just kept walking. She couldn't stop anyway because walking was the only way to keep warm. The snow was getting thicker. She walked into a snowdrift. The snow was above her knees. She had to raise her leg very high just to take a step. She began to grow very tired. She wanted to sit down and have a rest, but it was still snowing. She was frightened that if she fell asleep, the snow would cover her and she would never get up again. Magda kept walking. She stumbled over something and fell. She was too tired to get up again. She just lay there and thought of her father's hut and a warm fire. After a while, Magda began to shiver. She knew she had to get up and start walking again, but she couldn't. She was too tired after moving the tree trunk into the pit to help the mammoth. It was the end. She knew that. Then, through the falling snow, Magda saw a huge shape. It was a mammoth. It would stamp her to death. She waited for the huge feet to land on her. The mammoth came closer. Magda realised it was going to roll on her and squash her. The long hair of the mammoth fell against her face. She could feel it close, but it wasn't squashing her. It was on one side of her and above her, but it wasn't pushing her to the ground. Then she realised it was the young mammoth she had helped. The mammoth had used its body to make a private cave. It was soft and warm and comfortable. Magda began to feel drowsy and fell asleep. When she woke, the mammoth was still sheltering her. She tried to get up, but she was gently wedged. She tapped the mammoth on its side and it got up. Magda got up too. "Thank you, mammoth," she said. "We are friends now, aren't we?" The mammoth came closer and nuzzled its trunk against her face. "So what am I going to call you?" Magda said. "You are big to me, but to a real mammoth, you are tiny. I'll call you Tiny." Tiny breathed loudly through his nostrils in agreement. Magda began to walk again through the snow. Tiny followed her, but the snow was too thick. Soon Magda began to feel tired again. "I wish I had your legs, Tiny," she said. Tiny gave another loud snuffle. Magda stopped and looked at him. She stroked his long woolly trunk. "You understand me, don't you?" "I don't think you understand my words, but you understand my thoughts. What if I ride on your back?" Tiny snorted. Magda gripped Tiny's long hair and pulled herself up until she was able to climb onto his head. She swung her legs so that one was on either side of his neck. She was able to keep her balance by holding onto his woolly hair. With Tiny's long legs, they travelled much more quickly through the snow. For 3 days they travelled until all Magda's acorns had gone. The next day, Magda saw the smoke of a fire in the distance. They climbed up a small hill, and in the valley below, Magda saw the huts of a village, her village. She recognised it because her tribe always put the huts up in the same order. But as Tiny made his way down the slope, Magda suddenly saw something else. At first, she thought it was reindeer. Then she remembered reindeer always travelled in herds. These reindeer were in a long line. They were walking towards her tribe's village. This was the other tribe. They were going to attack her village. "Faster, Tiny!" Magda shouted, bumping her knees against his neck. He sped up, but mammoths don't go very fast downhill. Then one of the men in her village saw the reindeer tribe coming. He let out a shout. All the men grabbed their weapons. All the women and children ran into the huts. The other tribe had a lot more men. They faced up to each other, and the other tribe began to charge. "Hurry up, Tiny!" Magda shouted. As the slope gave way to flat ground, Tiny charged. The reindeer men were running across the plain with their clubs and spears raised. Then they stopped. A woolly mammoth was charging at them, and on top of it was a girl with a spear. For a moment, they stood and stared. Then their leader, who was wearing a big stag's antlers, turned and ran. The others followed him. Tiny and Magda charged until they got to the trees. They stopped there. But the reindeer tribe kept on running and was never heard of again. Magda's family was very glad to see her. The next spring, when the tribe went back to their old campground, Magda went into the hills to find the cave where she had escaped from the saber-toothed tiger. She took a lamp with her and a clay pot full of animal grease with a tangle of moss for a wick. In the flickering light, Magda used a brush made of animal hair to paint on the wall the scene when she was chased towards the pit by the mammoths and the reindeer tribe. Then Magda crept through the hole in the wall into the second cave. There she painted another picture of what had happened after that. When she had finished her painting, she sat and stared at it. She wondered if anyone else would ever see it. Many years later, there was a rock fall inside the cave. The entrance to the tunnel between the caves was filled with rocks. It was completely blocked. Chapter 6. The Second Cave. Lucy stepped back from the painting in the cave. She did not notice that the rest of the group had turned to go. Lucy had that strange feeling again, as if she had been there before. The hair was rising on the back of her neck. Her gaze seemed to go straight to a pile of rocks on the ground. She noticed that the wall went in a bit just above them. Later, when she was asked by the television reporter why she did what she did next, she told him she didn't know. It just seemed like the right thing to do, so she did it. She got down on her hands and knees and started to move the rocks one by one. When she had cleared all the rocks, Lucy took the torch out of her pocket and switched it on. The beam kept going into a hole. "A tunnel," she gasped. Holding the torch in front of her, Lucy started to crawl through the tunnel. That was how she found the hidden cave. Later, they brought in big jackhammers to make the tunnel wider and taller so that everybody could go through it and see the second painting. But now Lucy crept through the darkness until she came out into the second cavern. As she stood up, the torch revealed the painting Magda had done long ago. It was of two tribes fighting. One tribe was standing near huts. The other tribe was wearing antler horns. They were being chased by a girl with long brown hair. She was riding a mammoth and had a spear in her hand. As Lucy looked at it, she knew that this was the girl from the first painting. The little mammoth hunter had survived. Lucy was so glad. She stood on tiptoe to get a better look at the figure on the wall. "Hello," she said, "my little friend from long, long ago." Play the great word game. Play against the computer or write your name and click Next. Guess 5 words from Magda the Mammoth Hunter. What's the word? Whoops. The word was flames. What's the word? Yes, you got it. The word was mammoth. What's the word? Whoops. The word was antlers. What's the word? Yes, you got it. The word was weapons. What's the word? Yes, you got it. The word was torch. Great word work. Click Print to print your results or play again.
Story Toolbox. Type your name and click Next. Create a new story. Have fun clicking on the buttons. Then drag items onto the board to make a picture. Type or write your story underneath the picture. Click Next to make another page or click Finish to view your story. Fantastic work! Click Save to save your story, click Print to print your story, or click Start Again to make another story.